Hi, and welcome back to the Bone Club. You're here with Jenna, Ashley, and Stephanie. On the last episode that we recorded, we talked about scientific communication with our guest speaker, Laura. We've been finding the interview and guest style has been working really well for us, so we've decided to keep that style going. And before we get into this week's guest and topic, we want to quickly just apologize for our long absence from the show. Life has been a little crazy for all of us, and we appreciate your patience while you waited for our next episode to come out. On an exciting note, me, Jenna, speaking to you now, I got a job. So I'm now working for the court system here in Ontario as an exhibits clerk. Um, Full disclaimer, though, I have to go through the nitty-gritty of it. My opinions and statements are my own, and they are not a reflection of the Ontario or Superior Court of Justice or the Ministry of the Attorney General. So anything that I say is just purely my own opinion and how I feel about stuff, and it has nothing to do with our Ontario court system. That being said, I'm going to throw it over to Ashley to introduce this week and our new guest.
Well, hello and welcome everybody. Today we have Tiffany, and she'll be discussing isotopes, which is something that one of you all wanted us to discuss today. So we wanted to talk about isotopes today because this is a new and growing area within the field of anthropology, particularly in the area of identifying people and locations from where they come from. And we have today Dr. Tiffany Prakasha.
Rakia.
Rakia. Not like the bread. Who is a professor at Vanderbilt University. So if you want, go ahead and introduce yourselves and what got you interested in isotopes as a area of research.
Well, again, I'm Dr. Tiffany Fracchia, and I'm an associate professor of the practice of anthropology at Vanderbilt University. In addition to that, you hear that professor of the practice piece. What that means is I'm also in my field of study actively practicing. So here in the Middle Tennessee area, I'm responsible for forensic anthropology casework across numerous counties. So I actually completed a forensic case today. And so I do casework, I'm teaching courses, and I'm actively engaged in research. And so I really like the question of how did I find my way to isotope analysis? Because I did not start out as a young child or a teenager, or even an undergraduate student thinking, wow, I really want to do isotope analysis as a research topic, or this is something I want to learn more about. It was not until I was working on a master's degree in biology with still a very strong focus in anthropology that I first heard about isotope analysis as a tool for forensic anthropologists. I heard about it at a workshop for forensic anthropologists, and they were talking about what happens when the biological profile that we create as forensic anthropologists doesn't lead to any prospective identifications. And here in the United States, what happens is that case goes cold very quickly. And isotope analysis can tell us a little bit more about someone. It's important to note that this is not an outright identification tool. So we don't get the same one-to-one comparison like we do for DNA, where it tells you exactly who this person is. Isotope analysis gives us sort of big picture categories. And the whole premise that makes it work is that you are what you eat and you're also where you eat. So we can use chemical signatures from our bones and from our teeth and from our hair and other tissues to tell us more about someone's dietary history and their geographic origins. So when I first heard about this and I heard new tool in forensic anthropology, all of these bells and whistles started going off for me in terms of that could be something I could learn more about. And I think for a lot of graduate students, that's the struggle, is being very intimidated because you love this field. So for us, we love anthropology, we love forensic anthropology, and we want to contribute to our field with research, but it feels like everything's already been done. And so for me to hear that there was something new that was so obviously exciting for people, that really drew me in, and I wanted to know more. I did mention I did a master's degree in biology, so that hard science piece of this is also really appealing to me. And so it became a way that I could merge anthropological theory with sort of a hard science. And that was really what prompted me to look into this further. I was very fortunate to work with Dr. Donnie Stedman at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville as my dissertation advisor. And I had talked to Dr. Stedman early on in my application process about wanting to pursue isotope analysis as a research topic for my dissertation. And she was very supportive from the beginning. It's important to note that isotope analysis is a destructive analysis. And so when you're looking for a research topic, you have to think about the materials that are available to you. And so, since our skeletal collections are such a precious and finite resource, and we also want to treat them with the utmost respect, we have to really consider whether the data that we're getting and what we can learn from that is justified in the questions that we're asking and that destructive analysis piece of this. So that was sort of how I wandered into this and a few of the pieces about how I got there. I did do my dissertation research at the UT Knoxville Forensic Anthropology Center Anthropology Research Facility, also very commonly known as the Body Farm. That's also something that's available for us to talk about today if you have questions about that. But in general, this idea of figuring out who someone is using an extra clue or extra information using diet history and also using geographic travel history was what sort of got me there.
So interesting. Um, but I do have one question. What are isotopes and isotopic analysis? I mean, it's yeah, what
For,
are they?
for the non-chemistry people, maybe people who haven't taken those hard sciences.
We talked about what was exciting about this topic for me, but we should also mention what was intimidating about this topic for me. A lot of people don't enjoy chemistry. I was very excited about the hard science piece of this, but I was very intimidated by the chemistry piece of this. And so it's important to know that using isotope analysis, which is again using those sort of chemical signatures that we can get from our bones and teeth and other human tissues to tell us more about a person's lived experiences. Thinking about that from an anthropological perspective is very different than thinking about it from the chemistry laboratory perspective. And so not only did I receive anthropological training, but I had to seek out opportunities to learn the chemistry piece of this. And so I attended a 2-week intensive course, which was at the time held at the University of Utah, called IsoCamp. And so my friends to this day refer to this as that time you went to nerd camp. But it was 2 weeks intensive learning about all of the biology and chemistry that goes into this. So the question of what is an isotope requires us to go back to chemistry. And so what I always ask people to do is picture the periodic table and think about all of those letters and numbers in those little squares on the periodic table. If we scrolled across the periodic table and we found the element carbon, we would find the number 6 with the element carbon. And what that number 6 tells us is that there are 6 protons in the nucleus of a carbon element. So having those 6 protons means that it's carbon. It's going to act like carbon no matter what. But there are different versions of carbon. And so those different versions come to us by the number of neutrons that are present. So what we're looking for is adding those together, and we get carbon-12 when there are 6 of those, and we get carbon-13 when there are 7. And we also get the radiogenic or the radioactive version of carbon, which is carbon-14, which a lot of people have heard of for use in radiocarbon dating. So telling us how old the really old stuff is. So an isotope, very simply put, is two versions of the same element. So it's got just a slight difference of the contents of its nucleus. It's always going to have 6 protons because it's carbon, but there is slight variety in those other components that make up that atom. So pretty easy, right? And when we do isotope analysis, what we're actually doing is measuring the ratio of those two different versions. So we talk a lot about stable isotope analysis. And what this means is we're looking at the stable form. So they stay consistent over time. So they don't break down the same way radiogenic or radioactive elements do. So that radiocarbon, that carbon-14, breaks down, has a decay that's very different from these more stable versions. So that's where we get that stable isotope analysis piece of this. So when we're making these measurements, we're using a mass spectrometer, and we are combusting samples, and we're measuring those different forms of the elements we're interested in, and then we're reporting those as a ratio. So a few of the elements that I'm interested in isotopic analysis of are carbon and nitrogen, oxygen, and strontium. So these are the ones that I use in anthropology pretty frequently.
I really like how you said, you know, you are what you eat, you are where you eat, those types of things. I know in like my personal like work with isotopes, uh my boss always says it's like eating vanilla ice cream, but do you like French vanilla or do you like regular vanilla or do you like there's various kinds, and sometimes you might put a scoop of French vanilla and a scoop of regular vanilla in your bowl and you have all of that inside of you. And so I really appreciate the like you are what you eat situation. I'd say as far as so for a lot of our listeners, they're anthropology students or just lay people who probably, like myself, didn't really enjoy my chemistry classes in school if I took them. But when you're thinking about carbon and the variations on carbon, what do I guess for our audience, what does that carbon and nitrogen reflect dietarily? Is it a certain type of food or what?
So, yes, so we mentioned that there are a couple different things we can get from isotopes, one of those being sort of a picture of someone's diet. So when we're looking at carbon isotopes, we're actually looking at what kind of plants people are eating. So isotope analysis has this very rich history in anthropology, and it actually started in archaeology. So looking at the remains of people from the past. And so the questions that we wanted to ask and answer were, we think we're seeing certain cultural practices reflected in the artifacts that are found with these people. But does that truly reflect what's happening? So, for example, if we're finding evidence of agriculture, and we're presuming that people were engaging in maize agriculture, so they were growing corn. Were they actually eating the corn, or were they doing something else with the corn? And so when we drill down quite literally to these chemical analyses of human remains, what we would be looking at are those embodiments of cultural practices. So we're looking at what kind of foods were they consuming? And we differentiate plants by these different categories. And so primarily we're interested in what we call C3 plants and C4 plants. There's something else called CAM plants that can factor into this, but that gets really complicated. So for sake of this discussion, we'll focus on C3 versus C4. And when we're differentiating those, we can talk about the C3 plants as being things that we think of as a more wild grain-based diet. So things like wild grasses, things that we would think would occur naturally in the environment, as opposed to C4 plants, which are things that we associate more with agriculture and cultivation. So things like corn, sugarcane. Those are things that we see marking that difference in behavior archaeologically. So that's really where isotopes as a tool kind of got its start with anthropology. And we were really interested in what people were eating and what kinds of plants they were eating. When we measure nitrogen, what we're actually asking is, where are you on the food chain? So we're looking at whether someone has a more plant-based diet or has more meat in their diet. And what we're essentially measuring is the protein content from meat-based products. So when you see someone higher up on the nitrogen values, you can assume that they are eating more meat in their diet.
I say, is that also true for, like, I know a lot of the like isotope stuff that I do for my job is trying to determine, are you a US citizen or eating, a typical US diet versus eating, a non-typical US diet. And a lot of times we look at carbons and nitrogens to try to get at that. And one thing that's always talked about at work is United States, you eat a lot of meat, like you might not necessarily eat a lot of corn, but the meat you're eating is eating a lot of corn, and that's not necessarily true worldwide. So like kind of thinking about, cultural differences between what different areas of the world might be eating. Can you look at that and try to get at migration or movement of people, both, I guess, archaeologically and anthropologically?
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic question. And that's where I see the most active research right now in a lot of aspects of isotope analysis is an attempt to address these questions about deceased migrants who have died in a different place than they lived, right? So when we think about geographic history, we're thinking about where someone's been over the course of their lives. And so when we ask those questions, we can use diet. We can also use things like the drinking water consumption, and we can measure that and make comparisons to drinking water across the world. And so we use oxygen isotopes for that. And we can also use strontium as a geolocator. When you're thinking about diet and sort of making those differentiations between people, I think it's always useful to use what we call a multi-isotope approach. And I think that in your question was sort of embedded that idea, right? So it's not just which plants are you eating, but it's which plants are you eating in combination with how much protein you're getting in your diet. And then not just what are you eating, but what were your protein sources eating as well, right? Isotopes do sort of have that compounding effect. And so we are absolutely able to make these sort of distinctions if a population's behaviors are distinct enough, right? So that's always one of the questions that you have to start with in that preliminary research is, can we find enough of a split between two different populations to say confidently, if a person has these values, they would most likely sort into this group. And if a person has these values, they would most likely sort into this group. And those two don't overlap or have minimal overlap. And that's ideal for sorting. So in the example you've given, you're thinking about people who've consumed a US-based diet, what's available to us, very commercially, in those resources that we associate with US agriculture, versus something that may be a more grain-based diet. That's a product of plants growing differently in different parts of the world, right? Based on climate, based on soil types. So there are a lot of different pieces that we have to think about, but that sorting piece of this is super useful when you're asking the question, is this person local or not local? So does this person isotopically look like what we would expect from someone who originated in this area? Or does this look like someone who may have been traveling from somewhere else? So in the United States, we know that we have a crisis at our southern border where we have people who are navigating hostile terrain and are succumbing to that in the desert, people who are dying far away from where their journey started. And so, if we don't have any information about who that person is, a good starting point would be knowing where they came from so that we could start um, advertising that biological profile to find out if there are any missing persons in that particular area that might match the person that we've recovered, and hopefully be able to repatriate those remains to their loved ones. Um, this isn't a problem that's exclusive to the United States. Over the summer, I did some work in Tanzania where they're just starting the conversation. Tanzania has two main migrant routes that pass through a desert as well. So one to the north, where people are coming from multiple countries trying to get to the Mediterranean, and then one that travels sort of to the south for people who are trying to get to South Africa. And people are coming from multiple countries, and it's very difficult to know where people originated, again, so that those bodies can be repatriated. So it's a problem within Tanzania, regarding, what do we do with these bodies? How do we honor these bodies according to their lived customs and traditions? But also the volume, which is something that we're experiencing at the southern U.S. border as well. So being able to address these humanitarian needs of human identification, we need all the tools in our tool belt, and isotopes, I think, is a very useful one for that.
And this may be in the realm of theoretical more than practical at the moment, but can you also do this temporally, as well as geographically? I mean, I'm thinking the changes we've had in U.S. agriculture over the time, particularly with the development of grain, the development of corn, the development of soybean, development of our grasses to make them more stable, climate stable, etc. Would that have an impact on the isotopes? And could you theoretically at some point be able to say, this is someone from an older population because we see this type of isotopic signature, and this one's from a newer population because we see a different isotopic signature?
I think that's a great question, and I think that would be a fantastic avenue for somebody who's looking for a research project to sort of pursue. I think that it's got some good grounding theoretically, because I'm just thinking of other examples of ways that we've um, sort of exploited chemical signatures from body tissues to tell us even more about a person. The example I'm thinking of that gives us a little bit of a timeline temporally is lead content
Mm.
in people, because we can measure lead content in populations where lead was part of the glaze that was put on our dinnerware, or lead in our pipes, but also leaded gasoline. And
Yeah.
so when we were breathing that, so that's something that has been used to sort of differentiate populations where leaded gasoline was used for longer periods of time than it was in the US. So there's definitely a sorting mechanism there. So um, you know I think that's a reasonable precedent to say that what you're proposing would, potentially be viable for sure.
Stephanie, you're
Sorry, I
muted.
thought I was muted or I thought I was unmuted. But so kind of along those same lines of like research questions that might not have been, answered yet, because isotopes, while not being a new field overall, because there's been plenty of isotope research as far as soil content and other things like that and other fields of practice, but it's relatively new in anthropology. Do you have, I guess, any advice for someone who's, might be listening and thinking, oh, I kind of like the idea of diet and migration patterns and getting to know that lived experience of the person. Um, any like avenues of like how they should go about trying to decide maybe what schools are good for isotopic research, or what are areas that like the field has kind of been wanting people to do, but it just hasn't quite happened yet. Just any advice for that type of stuff?
Sure. That, and, again, that was sort of the genesis for my dissertation project. My dissertation focused on looking at taphonomic processes and how they potentially impact isotopes. And I did that using hair. And so, as anthropologists, we're very often thinking about bones and teeth, because that's usually what we get. But those of us who practice in more arid conditions, so my colleagues who work in Peru often recover 1,000-year-old locks of hair. The primary decomposer of hair is fungus. So fungus really enjoys warm, wet areas. So if you have drier areas like crypts or tombs, or even high altitude arid climates, fungus doesn't like it, and it doesn't grow very well there, which means you get a lot of preservation of hair. We also know at contemporary crime scenes, we recover scalp hair. I've recovered beard hair, like a full length beard at a crime scene before. So we have hair available to us. One of the reasons anthropologists should care about hair in terms of human identification is that it provides us the most recent information about a person's diet and geography. So if we think about our teeth, your teeth are the same teeth that you grew and developed when they first came in. So our tooth enamel can decay or erode, but we don't really grow new tooth enamel. So I always joke, don't be buying that toothpaste that tells you it's going to regrow your enamel, because it's just not true. So what's great about the static nature of our tooth enamel is that it records our lived experiences in our childhood when those teeth are growing and developing. And so that becomes sort of a permanent record that we have of what we were eating and where we were eating it at the time those teeth were developing. So when we're talking about our permanent teeth, we're usually looking at, between 2 and 8 years old, depending upon the tooth, right? When you think about bone, our bones are alive and growing. So they respond to our activities, which means you kind of make yourself new bones every so often. And that's a slow but ongoing process. And so our bones are sort of that cumulative of our lived experiences over that turnover or regrowth time period. And it really depends upon which skeletal element that you're sampling. And of course, there are a lot of lived experiences and factors that go into that as well. But you're looking at a greater time span, right? So anything, between 10 and 30 years, depending upon which bone you're sampling. But your scalp hair grows at about a centimeter a month, which means in a strand of hair, if you chopped it into little 1 centimeter segments, however long that strand of hair is, you're going to have that many months of lived experiences recorded. So, what that affords us is the opportunity to build a lifetime history. We can take those teeth and look at childhood. We can take the bones and look at sort of that overall lived experience over the last however many years. And then the hair, again, in those 1 centimeter segments, gives us a monthly recap. And so we can build that lifetime history with that information. So, what I think is really cool is that, we used this as a tool in archaeology to tell us about people's lived experiences, right? There's not a way to double check whether or not we got it right. we can use that information to support that story we're telling about the past through our archaeological work. And we have other lines of evidence that may support that story as well, but there's not a double check. When we start applying these theories to forensics, the stakes are different. So what that means is this technique has to stand up to that rigor and scrutiny. And if we get it wrong, there's potentially a major consequence. The consequence is that someone is going to go unidentified, right? So there's still going to be a person who's unidentified, whose family or loved ones are still waiting for answers about them. So for that reason, we really have to ask questions like, does this work the way we think it's going to? So that was a very long, drawn out way of saying we got to make sure it works in all of these different situations. And that was the driving force behind my dissertation, was saying, does this work the way we think it's going to? A body donation program like the one at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, for the Body Farm or the Anthropology Research Facility, is an ideal place for this because people pre-register. So they have thousands of people who are so excited about forensic science that they've elected to pre-register as body donors upon death. And part of that pre-registration process is to provide living information, ante-mortem data. And so some of the questions they ask are about lifetime residence histories and are about, do you have any kind of special diet? And so we can actually ground truth, the isotopic results that we get, looking at that data that was self-reported by these people when they were alive. And so it's an ideal place to do this kind of research because there's a way to double check yourself. And so my advice to somebody who's looking for an avenue of research related to isotopes would be, to think about, how have we been using this tool? And where are the question marks that we still have? And I'll tell you, there are, quite a few. There's a lot of ways that we can look at this and say, is this tool telling us what we think it is? One really important area, I think, is just the overall expansion of the data sets that we have. Because when you talk about this person looks local or this person looks non-local, local versus non-local can be a very broad category. It can be US or non-US, or it could be Tennessee or New Mexico, or it could be, US versus Europe. So our data and our comparisons are only as good as the data sets that we have. So finding ways to expand those data sets, whether it is through environmental comparisons or through questions that involve isotopic analyses of human samples, I think there's a lot of room for us to grow the field.
I'd say I know one topic that I've been trying to like wrap my own brain around of like, how can I get at the answer, I guess, is you were talking about how, your teeth are your childhood, your hair is the last couple months, depending on how long it is. But within the field of anthropology, we don't really know how fast bone turns over because there's so many different factors that come into play of like why bone, turns over to begin with, where like your ribs are constantly moving. So are they turning over faster than your legs and your arms and different things like that? But it's never really, or at least from all the literature that I've read, there's never been a clear answer of like, people think, oh, the last 5-10 years, but is that at the mid shaft? Is that at, your epiphysis or the ends of your bones? Those like trying to really get at how bone turns over. I think even if you're not necessarily like interested in isotopes, I think isotopes is a fabulous like avenue to try to figure that out, because you can see, well, if you happen to have access to skeletal remains, that you can do multiple destructive testing on, to like get at that turnover by sampling various parts of bone, various different aspects of bone throughout the body, and trying to get at how fast that person turned over, especially if you know their lived history. And so I know like that's one that I've been like, oh, I just want to know, like, because we like for the research that I've done so far is like trying to figure out, you know, is it all one person? Or do I have commingling in my assemblage? And when you're like, well, I'm testing this bone versus this bone to say it's one person, but I don't really know how those bones turn over. So is this reliable? Is this like actually getting at what I want it to get at? And I know my brain constantly is just like about all of it because it's just like there's so much that can be done with isotopes, which is exciting. I guess you're saying, because this is kind of the part that I've never done in any of my isotope research, is I don't really go to court. So my experience with like how the public views isotopes and, you know, do they trust it, do they not, those types of things is just from tours at the lab of being like, it's so cool, you are what you eat. And then like no one really asks more questions than that because they're so overwhelmed with data. But how do you find that like in a public forum like court testimony do people view isotopes?
I think that's a good question. And, I get the question pretty frequently in general as a forensic anthropologist about, what's it like to testify? And I've never testified on a forensic case. And, I've done hundreds of cases at this point. But I think, it depends on what the question is with your case and the contentious nature of that question, right? I think that's the most important piece. So, most of the time, as anthropologists utilizing the tool of isotopes for forensics, we're trying to make an identification. And so once that identification is made, we're not going to use isotopes to individualize that identification. We're going to use some other means like antemortem record comparison, like either, x-rays of the bones or dental records or DNA. We're gonna use that as our formal means of identification. The bioprofile that the anthropologist prepares, and maybe even the isotope analysis as an additional piece of information, is going to help with identification. So it's not going to help with the what happened to this person piece, which is usually what winds up being the contested portion of the anthropologist's work in court. Now, that's not to say that the technique of isotope analysis should not stand up to the rigorous examination that we give in court. It absolutely should, and it should be a tool that has repeatable results and that we're able to produce error rates and things like that on. And, and it's still new. So we're still working on that information. And that's something that we have to continue demanding of those people who are utilizing the tool for forensic purposes. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't applications for this. So, I'm thinking specifically about a case from a few years ago where neglect and abuse was alleged. And so we know that nitrogen values can potentially be higher in individuals who are malnourished. So measuring isotope ratios of nitrogen from hair samples, for example, is frequently used for people who are being treated for eating disorders who might not be able to reliably report their own diets throughout the course of treatment. And so by measuring isotopes, nitrogen isotopes, you can sort of track that. People essentially sort of self-digest when they're malnourished. And so those nitrogen values get a little higher. And so in principle, you might be able to analyze those nitrogen values and prove or disprove neglect or malnourishment. The finite data on that, is debatable. And so does that stand up to a rigorous examination in court? Are we able to confidently say that? And so that would be an example of something where it would be on the practitioner who's reporting those results to explain to a jury, hey, this is what isotopes are, and go through that whole introductory lesson that we gave here in an accessible way, to a jury of people with basic education to help them understand what isotopes are and how they could potentially tell us this information, and then also provide us scientific evidence that shows that this is something that has been tested and is reproducible. And again, that big question, is it telling us what we think it's telling us? So, there'd have to be a lot of great care, I think, if we were going to accuse someone of a crime using isotopes.
So
I
is
say
it that it hasn't been used in a court of law yet because it hasn't passed admissibility criteria, or is it just that you yourself haven't?
I personally have never been asked to address a question like that with isotopes. And even in the cases where we're using this to provide leads for identification, that again, that's not really contested. One other point to make though is lots of people are jumping on the isotopes bandwagon. A lot of people are super excited about this as a tool that can be used. So you have labs that have been traditionally using isotopes archaeologically who are now shifting to saying, oh, well, we can provide this service for forensic questions as well. And because there is not one cookbook recipe for all the steps involved in sample selection, sample preparation, and analytical methods, and even interpretations. Because there's not a standard way of doing that, we've got people doing it all different ways. And so, you have to be very cautious about which laboratories are providing information for forensic purposes. Are those laboratories used to being asked to address questions forensically and understand fully, the gravity of that responsibility, and also that responsibility toward reproducibility of results, accounting for your methodologies, and all of those things? So, this is something that I think could be a potential problem, right? Because, there are a lot of tools that have been used forensically maybe once or twice, and then someone shows that there's not that repeatability piece of this that's so essential for scientific rigor, and it's like that technique gets a big black eye, and then evermore, even if it's the most useful technique, in the back of the mind of the average person, or, the court system or science in general, it's always like, but did it really work, or can we really trust it? And so that trust is such an important piece of forensic practice. And so that's why we have to stepwise evaluate if the tool is telling us what we think it is, right? And so that's why this is a wide open field for people who want to do research, because we got to validate all of these methods. We've got to try it this way and that way and see which way works the best. And then we as a field have to agree on this is how we're going to do it.
So, along those same lines, the field of all of the fields of forensic science we're going through the entire Academy standards boards. We're standardizing everything down to how we put a postage stamp on an envelope. Is this something that should be on their radar?
Yes, and it is. I think that's a great question. So, in response to the now notorious 2009 NAS report, scientific working groups were established for various fields in forensic science. Those scientific working groups have since been converted into the Organization of Scientific Area Committees, or the OSAC for forensic sciences. And so the OSAC is sort of works alongside NIST, so the National Institute for Standards and Technology, sort of helps facilitate OSAC meetings. So these groups, I'm a member of the OSAC subcommittee for forensic anthropology, and we are currently working on standards for isotope analysis. So that is something that is actively happening now. And that's something that I would strongly encourage, regardless of whether you want to learn more about isotope analysis or effective reporting as a forensic practitioner, or the do's and don'ts of DNA analysis. All of those have standards and best practices that are either in progress or have been published. And so that's a really fantastic way to find out what the official sort of position on how you do these things is. And, that's not to say there aren't still a lot of holes, a lot of gaps that need to be filled in that. But certainly, I think it's a strong response to a very valid critique of forensic science practice.
So yeah, I'm pretty sure that one just came out about isotopes not that long ago, for like report writing and things like that, that I read. And I mean, that's a great call for anyone within the field of anthropology as a whole to always go give your comments for those standards, because, it can get published, and if your opinion wasn't given, then it's not going to be accounted for, and trying to make the standard as whole as possible. So we're kind of coming up on our hour mark. I want to, respect both our guest time and our listeners' time. So kind of just want to recap and say thank you so much for coming on and explaining what is a very broad and interesting topic in a way that I think, and I hope that our listeners, can really understand, and maybe it piqued some interest and gave them some questions, which I think is always the best part about forensic science, is like you listen to something and you're like, oh, wait, I have more questions on that. And then that is the basis of all research. So just want to thank everyone for coming. If our listeners have any more topics that you want us to talk about, if you want more isotope, we can always, have a part 2 or part 3 or whatever if you have more specific questions. But you can also always email us at our email that's in the link. And then I'm gonna poke and call and see if Tiffany, you'd be willing to give your email as well. We can add it to the kind of description for this podcast to see if like anyone has any specific questions that they would like to ask you, maybe about, your work in Tanzania, or, your work with Vanderbilt, or even the body farm, if they could reach out to you specifically. But yeah, I think that's really it. If anyone has any last minute comments or whatever they want to make.
Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I just was inspired to write like 5 different proposals. That was such an interesting topic. I've never been a chemistry minded person, and that was like, I'm like exploding with ideas. My partner's not going to love me when I say that I want to quit my job and go back to school. But yeah, that was a really, really fascinating topic. And thank you so much, Dr. Tiffany Fracchia, for giving us all of that. That was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Well, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Bone Club. See y'all soon.
Bye bye.
All right.